Okay, good morning, everyone. Well, firstly, thanks for everyone for making the effort to come and listen to my talk. It's tough being the first talk of the day, particularly the morning after the pirate ship. Personally, if I was in your position, I probably would have stayed in bed and just watched it on YouTube. It's good to be back at ZephCon. I think this is my fourth time attending, third time speaking. Similar to my previous presentations, I'll be talking a little bit about C2, beacon detection, a few ideas around evasion for red teamers. And my previous talks were all on kind of endpoint-based detections, whereas this time I decided to approach it from a different perspective, which was from network-based detections. So why did I decide to give this talk? Well, I think, like C2, the actual comms is often the poor relation in malware development. Most research topics that come out are focused around endpoint-based evasion, the latest and greatest techniques for unhooking, for stack spoofing, that kind of stuff. But no way near as much attention is actually given to the basic building blocks of a beacon. In fact, when I was researching this talk, I found there was very few other researchers talking about network-based beacon detection or evasion, and that was one of the reasons why I wanted to look into it. Also, there was a few occasions where during our own red team engagements, we'd had problems with beacon detection where some of our more mature clients were able to pluck out our own beaconing. And I wanted to understand really how this was happening and what sort of tricks we could employ ourselves to get around some of those detections. So we're also seeing a bit of an evolution in some of the defensive solutions as well that are giving us some headaches. So things like browser isolation, where parts of the web page are rendered on a remote server rather than on the actual user's browser, and this can completely break C2. We're seeing more products integrating AI and enhancing and augmenting their own analysis. And then finally, C2 detection is actually getting a little bit more attention from the EDR vendors now. So for example, Microsoft recently added a new telemetry feature in Defender for Endpoint, which will allow you to generate 2 reports on connection success and connection failed in the aggregated log reports. And this can be used to give you historic telemetry on network activity, and you can build KQL queries that will help you do beacon detection with it. So this was something I wanted to look at. But before I kind of dive into beacon and how beacon detection works, I'm just going to cover some very basic concepts on how C2 frameworks typically perform beaconing. So I think traditionally a C2 comms network would probably look something like this, where you've got n number of kind of peer-to-peer nodes connected to an egress node. And then the beacons will kind of go to sleep in line with their configured sleep cycle, then wake and retrieve some tasks from the C2 server, and then the C2 server will respond with the tasking that they need to do. The sleep cycle is typically customizable based on sleep times and jitters that can be embedded in the beacon profile. And then the jitters just used to add some random variance into the C2 to kind of prevent this completely uniform and predictable pattern of requests. HTTP comms are pretty much the de facto standard for this and is used or implemented by all C2 frameworks. And this usually works on the concept of a pull. And this will be interesting when I kind of get towards the end of my talk, when I'll look at like some C2 transports that we can use that don't work on a pull but work on a push basis so that you can avoid beaconing. But typically the way it works is the beacon will make a request. It's usually like a HTTP GET. And that's the beacon's heartbeat as well, telling the C2 server that it's still there. And the server will respond with a list of tasks to complete. The beacon will go off and do them, and then send the results of those tasks to the C2 server. Pretty standard. The tasking behavior is then usually configurable within the beacon. This one's taken from Cobalt, and essentially it allows the operator to build how they want the HTTP request to look. And then when the beacon's doing its tasking, it will make a request to, in this case, the kind of jQuery URI. The interesting thing about Cobalt is, even though it allows you to have multiple URIs, only a single one gets embedded inside the artifact. So even if you're using multiple hosts in like a round-robin fashion, they'll all be hitting the same URI endpoint. Havoc works slightly differently. It allows you to provide like a list of URIs to beacon back to. The beacon will just randomly select one of them. This is obviously slightly better. A slightly better strategy is it increases the pool of URIs that are being requested, meaning there's kind of less repeatable patterns. Nighthawk works kind of similar to Havoc in that you can provide like a full list of URLs with different hosts, and then they'll just be randomly selected for tasking. The only real difference to Havoc in this case is that you can add parameters to the request to make them look a little bit more legitimate. And then finally, Sliver is probably the most interesting of all of them, as it allows you to configure the URIs using building blocks. So you can provide like word lists of extensions, file names, paths, and then the beacon will just randomly select them at runtime to construct its URL. And this is probably the most effective of all of them at avoiding patterns that could be used for beacon detection. So if you intercept some of the comms, it might look something like this, where we've got a bunch of like GET requests that are being made, and then the POST request is obviously the result of the tasking that's happening. Now, I don't think I'm the only person who probably looks at some of those patterns. This chain of kind of GET and POST requests on a small pool of URIs, and thinks, well, that doesn't probably blend in with normal user browsing traffic, and it could be maybe a little bit suspicious. I can see like Justin's kind of hinted this a few times on X, and I was kind of curious. Well, can we build network-based detections for beaconing on some of these things, and how effective are they? Well, the spoiler is it's a little bit tricky, and particularly if you're looking to do it at scale, but it does happen. So at a high level, I kind of categorize the different vectors that we can use for detection into 4 different categories. So firstly, timing. So this is obviously the specific time intervals that each request that the beacon is making. There's the content of the actual C2 requests and the responses themselves. You can get IOCs in the transport that can be used for detection. So the hosting infrastructure, that kind of stuff that you're using to actually funnel your C2 requests over. And then finally, the tradecraft. Does the beaconing blend in with normal behavior? And this could be many things. It could be, for example, the operator's choice of selected host process. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail. So firstly, timing. So beacon activity is typically identified by analyzing time intervals or time delta between consecutive connections. The idea really is that the beaconing follows a relatively consistent time pattern where the time delta between the connections remains relatively uniform. So if you've got the telemetry and you analyze the times when the requests occur, applying a little bit of leeway for a sensible jitter, over a long enough period of time, you should be able to pick out a predictable pattern of beaconing. And there's a few things that we can use, assumptions that we can make when we look at this data if we analyze the times that the requests occur. So, for example, if we see a beacon checking in once per hour, then suddenly at 9 a.m. it starts checking in, maybe every 5 to 10 minutes, that might indicate some hands-on keyboard activity. And we can use this for other assumptions, things like attribution. A good example of this is the attribution that was done by China when they unpicked some of the kind of alleged equation group attacks on a Chinese university. And one of the factors that they used in their attribution was that 98% of all the hands-on keyboard work occurred between 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. Eastern time. So that gave them an indication that it was probably a US-based actor. For the content, there's a few interesting things, again, that we can use for detection points. So things like static hosts. So if we're seeing lots of requests to a single host, again, that can be suspicious. Are the kind of method patterns irregular? So like in this example, again, we can see the kind of repeated requests of GET requests for the heartbeats, and then the single post for the tasking. Are we seeing lots of requests to the same URI? And then finally, kind of like byte patterns. Now, this is probably one of the most interesting ones for me, and this is actually, we had a client that caught us out with this. If we can see patterns in the responses, you can see in this example, they're all kind of like broadly similar. And this is like relatively irregular. So with some kind of like pattern analysis on the responses, you can get a kind of bit of an understanding to whether or not a URL is being used for beaconing. Of course, there are like things you can do to make this a bit more difficult as a red teamer. So, you know, Cobalt Strike's got like a data jitter, for example, where you can add like some variance into the responses. The transports, the chosen transport as well can often lead to detection. So if you're using custom domains, there's a few things that might lead to you getting caught. So how mature is the domain? Does it have a nice reputation? Are there backlinks? Is it nicely categorized? You know, all that kind of stuff can be used to augment the telemetry that you've got. Domain fronting, you know, can be relatively problem fraught, trivially detected through SNI and host header mismatches. And then finally, kind of CDNs. Now, I think these are something that's been quite heavily used and abused by red teamers for a number of years, and this has led to a little bit more focus from blue teams. You know, certainly at MDSec, we are seeing more detections based on CDNs. So, for example, I had a red team quite recently. I've been caught out a couple of times, and the client eventually told us it was through beacon detection. And they told me the way they were doing it was essentially they were just collecting telemetry on the number of CDN requests per host into like an aggregated weekly log, and then they were just manually investigating the hosts that were higher on the volume end for CDN requests. So I was kind of interested, you know, how often are people getting detected by these types of things? So I ran a little poll on X, and I mean the results came back roughly as I expected. Most people are probably getting detected through tradecraft, but less frequently through the transports or through the actual contents of the C2 requests themselves. I think this probably, you know, broadly does represent the current state of C2 detection. Although I do think this will probably change in the future. You know, we're starting to see this in our own red team engagements, as I mentioned. You know, and some of our more mature clients are certainly better at picking up beaconing. With this in mind, I thought, well, how hard can it actually be to build something that is able to detect beaconing, you know, based purely on network and traffic analysis? And I thought I'd kind of give this a go myself. And I actually used like MDSec's own infrastructure to try and keep it as, you know, kind of realistic as possible. And this is what I came up with. And before I demo it and, you know, kind of show how it works, I'll just give a quick overview of the kind of concept. So we use like a cloud security gateway at MDSec, which does like web isolation and does proxying for all the web traffic in our own infrastructure. And the first thing I needed to do was to pull data out of it to give me something to analyze. So I just made like a little ingester, and all this does is it queries the API for the cloud security gateway, pulls down the raw proxy logs, and then kind of puts them into a database. Once I kind of got the data and the telemetry and all the proxy logs, I needed to narrow it down and look for things that were suspicious. So I built what I call the suspicious events detection engine. And this, as I said, basically tries to get like a subset of the proxy logs that I think might be more interesting to look at. And then when we've got that those suspicious events, I wanted to enrich that data. Now, there's lots of different things you could probably use for enrichment if you're looking to implement something like this. The things that I used were mainly the things that were free, so things like virus total scans of the URL, output from URL scan, domain information, SSL certificate information, that kind of stuff. So I basically went off and queried these different resources and used that to augment some of the data that I got. And then once we got that information, I basically handed it off to AI to do some analysis on it and asked it to determine whether it thought it was malicious or not. And then I also made like a small MCP server that would allow the AI to pull the full logs if it wanted to do additional kind of analysis and use that for its determination. So how does the kind of events detection engine work? Well, I built this using Python pandas. It's quite a nice little library that allows you to do grouping. And this helped me get the beaconing events down into a much smaller pool. So there's a few criteria that I used to kind of get that subset. So firstly, I just counted the number of kind of like unique URIs and the number of hosts over the time window. So the time window I had was, or when I implemented this, was about, I took 11 days worth of logs. There was roughly 2.5 to 3 million like proxy logs in there. And I basically used Python pandas to say these URIs or these hosts must have occurred or like been visible over a threshold within the window. So I think I initially by default I set it to like 45%. So we must have seen a request to that URI or a request to that host over 45% of that 11-day window. And then I also said we must have seen it a certain number of times. So there must be X number of requests to this host or this URI over, for example, 5 days in that 11-day window. Then the engine analyzed the response sizes to those requests and just looked for some consistency. So by default, it basically says 80% of those requests must fall within a certain percentage increase or percentage decrease of the average response size. And then it looks for uniform patterns. So it looks for consistent beaconing within those requests, disregarding any outliers. So I tried to make it such that we didn't care if, for example, the operator changed the sleep time to once every 4 hours, but then when they came back later, they dropped the sleep times to 60 seconds. I just disregarded the ones that were with the high sleeps and kind of categorized them as outliers. For the AI prompting, I basically just said to it, you're a cybersecurity analyst. I gave it, and then I asked it for a confidence score. I said, look at this data, look at this enrichment, and how confident are you that this is malicious beaconing? I did find that it worked better when I explicitly defined what the enrichment data was, the things that I was giving it, so it could understand it better. Then I also gave it a bit of a steer and told it to weight things slightly differently. So I said, if, for example, these requests are only occurring on one host, then that's probably more suspicious. But if you're seeing those requests on every host on the network, it's less suspicious. So let's have a little look at this in a demo. So as I said, in that 11-day window, I basically just inserted a beacon into our network and let it beacon through the proxy. With the C2, I basically just randomly generated a profile using SourcePoint. And then every day I just logged onto the machine and tried, just changed the sleep time. I sent it some tasking, tried to keep it a little bit realistic. And then I wanted to see with the proxy logs, could I actually pluck out the beacon? So I got a demo for this, and it is videoed because it does require some internet connectivity. But I'll just kind of talk it through. So. This is pretty much the core detection engine, which is built in Python pandas. And then I kind of like turned it into basically like a web app, so I could see the proxy logs. And there's quite a lot of stuff in there. As I said, there was I think somewhere between 2.5 million and 3 million requests. And you can see there's lots of stuff in there. People going to LinkedIn, people going to kind of Reddit. Probably should be working rather than reading Reddit, and certainly not on Facebook. But there's just lots of normal traffic. And then when you kind of click I'll just pause it there for a second. When you kind of click the suspicious events button, it goes to this page which allows you to toggle the criteria that you're using for the detection. So as I sort of said, I'm looking for in this case 45% coverage over the window, looking for 50 requests per day, and then it allows you to do some standard deviation in the sizes and the number of requests that responses that should fall in the certain size bounds, that kind of stuff. So when it runs, it will it's doing its collection now. This is the Python Panda stuff with the detection engine. It will give me a small number of hosts which it thinks might be suspicious. It definitely will because it's a video. So we've got this like small list of hosts, and then we can kind of drill down, and we can see. I've masked that one just because it's like one of our chat servers, but you can see which like URIs and which agents are connecting to it, that kind of stuff. We click on analyze, and basically it does some of the enrichment, and then it hands off that data to AI and asks it for this confidence score. So you can see it comes back in this case, and it's not completely confident. You can see it's basically saying I've got 30% confidence that this stuff to the Microsoft domain is malicious. It's probably benign behavior. So the AIs probably are outright. It's not really. It doesn't think it's malicious. If we pick another host, which is actually the beaconing host, this one on the Fastly, you'll see it comes back, and it's pretty confident that it is beaconing, just because it's saying, well, it's probably malicious because they're using a CDN. There's a lot of requests. There's only one IP. You should really go on and investigate this, which I thought wasn't too bad. And then you can ask it questions. So I was like, well, you're saying it's 75% confident that it's malicious beaconing, and I was like, I just want to know yes or no. Is it malicious? So you can ask it questions, and it'll go off, and it was, in this case, it's like, yes, this is malicious. So that's kind of how it works. It's not anything too complex. Like I pretty much made it over a weekend, so I would expect some of the EDR vendors and whatnot to be able to do something a bit more sophisticated than this. So what are the kind of problems with this approach? Well, it doesn't always. There's lots of ways it could be skewed. Doesn't always account for the operator factor. So, for example, if the operator is messing around with the sleep time a lot, that can obviously impact the results. If there's like a very large data jitter, that's definitely going to skew things. So it's not perfect. We also don't consider anything else. It's just purely network-based proxy traffic. So you could improve it with augmentation through endpoint information. So if you were able to see the processes that were making the requests and that kind of stuff, you could definitely make it more accurate. So I think overall my conclusion for the detection side of things was it is possible. You can build some detections. And there's some things that you can do at scale, but it's not 100%, 100% effective. So once I kind of got an understanding of how some of the detections can be done for beaconing, I was then kind of put my red team hat on, and I was interested in how can we kind of get around these? How can we make it less likely that we're going to get detected for suspicious beaconing? And the first kind of idea I had was leveraging this concept of traffic encoders. So traffic encoders are basically a way to kind of mutate both the requests from the beacon and the responses from the server at runtime and programmatically. And this kind of allows you to change how the C2 protocol is being encapsulated by encoding it into some other form. So, for example, we could have a traffic encoder that's based in the C2 server that might mutate all the tasking responses. It might maybe generate an image, and then use steganography to hide them inside an image. And that's completely doable. And I'm not saying this concept is anything new. It's supported in at least 2 C2s that I know of. I forgot the things going in and out. For example, Sliver has the ability to do this with WASM. And as I said, you can use that to completely change the request that the agent's doing at runtime and mutate it. But I don't think this is something that has been particularly heavily used by red teams. I know it's not something that we leverage a lot, but I think it's something that might be required maybe in the future as beacon detection matures. So I kind of like, well, can we use traffic encoders to kind of improve our C2 infrastructure, our C2 transports? Now, one thing that we kind of stopped using as a red team a few years ago, really, or stopped using heavily, was custom domains. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be cool if we could make custom domains kind of great again? Could we make them more legitimate, look like real browsing? And I thought this was maybe where traffic encoders come in. So I thought I'd kind of have a go at this. But before I could kind of do this, I needed a domain. So I had a quick look on kind of expired domains, looking what was available. There's a lot of sketchy stuff on there, as you probably can see. But you can occasionally pluck out some of the interesting ones. Essentially, you're just looking for things with lots of backlinks, domains that have been around for a while. And they, as I say, they do occasionally pop up. You just got to kind of monitor for them. One that I spotted that could potentially be interesting was this kind of like turkmilitary.com one. Because it said it had been around since kind of 2011, got a few backlinks associated with it. So I went and checked what its categorization was. You can see it's military. I thought, well, I'd like to beacon over some military C2, so that would be kind of cool. So I just went and registered it, and then I thought, well, like, I need some content like from the real site if I want to make it look like, if I want to kind of reignite and bring this turkmilitary.com website back to life, I need the actual content. So, Wayback Machine was great for that. So I just used like an offline mirror to pull all the old content back down from Wayback Machine. And then I was like, well, can I get this, use a traffic encoder to make it look like the real site, but still have my beaconing kind of going over it. And that's kind of like what I tried to build. And essentially, the idea was really that you could get lots of different sites and clone them, and then just have your beacon connecting over stuff that looks like the real site. So let's just pop this up. Okay. So I think this might still be live now. I can't remember if I took it down or not. But essentially, like, I just got all the content from Wayback Machine and just hosted it on the domain. And you can see you can kind of just like browse around it, like just like you would do normally. Like, there's nothing obvious to say that this is not a real website. It is the exact old content. And then I kind of like made this traffic encoder, and I'm just using, as I say, you can do this with Sliver. I'm just using Nighthawk purely because that's what I know best, and it was easier for me to kind of build this out in that. But essentially, I built like a profile that will take the content from the site and then embed the tasking information into the real content. So here I'm just like generating an artifact, and I'm going to send it over to my lab host. And then on the lab host, we're just going to run it. And this is just set up to send the traffic through Burp so we can have a look at it and see what it looks like. So you can see we've got the beacon, and again, we're just looking at it through Burp. It's beaconing back to this turkmilitary.com over HTTPS. The URLs are the same URLs that are on the actual old site. But if we look at some of the responses, I was just going to send some tasking just so we get a bit more data. So we'll send it some tasking. But if we start to look at some of the responses in Burp, what you should see is... There we go, I'm just going to pause that. It's the real response from the real site, so like what was actually there, but what the traffic encoder has done is it's injected just a JavaScript comment so this block of base64 is just the tasking information compressed, encrypted, and encoded. And that's just thrown in onto every every page. So we get the full content, and you can see if I just pause that again, if you look at the lengths of the responses on the right-hand side, I don't think I've got a pointer, but if you look at the length column, you can see they're completely different, right? So it helps us evade that concept of beacon detection based on patterns in the response sizes. And the beacon will just work over this, right? Like it doesn't care. It's just able to extract that information from the response. It doesn't care what it's encapsulated in. So that was the first kind of idea that I had for kind of getting around some of this beacon detection. Now this kind of stuff works generally well. Most environments, you can kind of get away with probably using CDNs or using custom domains. But there are examples or where clients are a bit more mature. Egress policies are stricter. There's a lot of investment in beacon-based detection, and you might need a little bit more advanced tradecraft, particularly if you're coming up against things like web isolation. You might need to be a little bit more creative. And this is kind of like where cloud services come in, because everyone trusts the cloud, right? You'll find like even in the most mature environments, there's a plethora of kind of high value, high reputation cloud services that are often just like whitelisted to connect outbound. So things like Teams, ServiceNow, Atlassian, and that kind of stuff. But these are, with the red team hat on, these are great for leveraging for your actual C2 beaconing. And the way we kind of achieve this is through API middleware. So the way API middleware works is it basically introduces some additional layers to your C2. So the classic transports, the beacon will be talking directly to the C2 server itself. There might be a redirector or equivalent in the way, but they're generally talking directly to each other. With API middleware, the beacon might be just putting the data somewhere and then leaving it. And then on the back end, your middleware component connects onto that service, for example, like the cloud service, retrieves that tasking information and sends it to the API server itself. And when you kind of get into using this, you start to see C2 everywhere. You can pretty much turn anything into a C2. The world's your oyster, really. A good example of this is, I don't know if anybody saw the Mandiant report recently on APT 41, and they were using Google Calendars for C2. And I'm not saying this is anything new. This concept has been around for a while. Cobalt Strikes had custom C2. Pretty much all the frameworks support the ability to do this, but I'm not necessarily sure it's heavily used, and there's very little work going into public channels. I know Melvin over there did some work on the service bus a couple of years ago, but there's not actually that many people pushing out things into the public domain. But this kind of stuff can be really interesting, and it can really help you blend in as a red teamer. I think most blue teams are probably not going to detect, beaconing. If you're beaconing over teams.microsoft.com from inside teams.exe, it's probably going to be tricky to pluck out. And there's lots of options for this kind of stuff, including like leveraging, when you've maybe got access to a host, you might have a look at what services are on there and then try and build your custom C2 to blend in with that sort of stuff. As I say, there's lots of options. There's Slack, Graph API, Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive. All of these are potential vectors for doing C2. But the things that I think are most interesting are like, maybe alternate protocols. There's no reason that we have to beacon over HTTP all the time, right? And most people do. There's been a couple of public examples of this. I think I can't remember who it was, but they did some implementations of using like Quick Protocol, which is, again, quite interesting. But one of the ones that are interesting for me, or the channels that are most interesting for me, are the ones where you don't actually have to beacon at all. You don't actually have to make an outbound request. And that is, you're flipping the concept of, if you remember at the start when I said beacons are typically built on pulls. So the beacon makes a request and then pulls the tasking. Why do we actually need to do that? Well, we don't. There are like a few other things that we can do. So I got an example of one channel that I built for us, which was using mail. As I say, I think the reason this is interesting to me is that you don't actually have to make a request outbound to get the tasking. It's built on a push basis. So when the beacon is actually trying to read its tasking, it's just looking in the mailbox for the tasking information. So it's not actually sending out anything out of the network. So there's nothing to actually look for. It's all driven by the server sending the tasking information down on more of a push basis. So I got a demo of kind of how this works. Whoops, the wrong video. Let's pop this open. So again, I've done this with Nighthawk, but you can do it with any C2 framework that supports custom C2. So the first thing I'm doing is just generating an artifact. And I'm telling that artifact to use the mail protocol handler, which in Nighthawk tells it to use which C2 channel to use. And then I'm just going to send it to my lab host. Then on the lab host, I start the back end first. So this is the actual API middleware component that logs into the mailbox and looks for mails. Now on the lab host, I'm just going to run the artifact, and what we'll see is, I'm just going to pause it there for a second. It says rule already exists. That's because I've run this channel before. Now the way it works is when the artifact first runs, and again, you can use this as shellcode, you can inject it into any process you want to, but it basically sets up like an Outlook rule on the Exchange server that forwards any mails from a specific recipient to a hidden mailbox folder inside Outlook, so the user never sees it. So essentially, there's like a number of hidden folders within Exchange. In this case, it's using one called the journal, and it's basically pushing the mail into that folder so the user never sees it. And then it just waits. When it calls, the first thing it does is it actually needs to tell the C2 server that it's here. So it sends like a mail outbound to the API server and basically says, yeah, I'm a new agent, I'm ready for tasking, which you can see is coming into this kind of like Gmail inbox. And then that's pretty much it. That's all it needs to do from a tasking perspective. So you can see we get a new beacon, but it hasn't got any of the metadata as of yet. What it'll do now is it'll just keep reading the mailbox, looking for new tasks. So as I said, it's not actually sending any mails out until it receives a task, and it chunks all these tasks as well. So I'm sending it some tasks to do, and we should get it'll come through basically with a new mail that won't be visible to the user. So again, it's just like reading that journal mailbox at the moment, and give it a second. There we go. I think it's picked it up now. So I'll just pause it there. So let's go back. Oh, missed it again. All right. So basically, you can see where it's it's kind of done these put responses. That's it sending the response to the tasking. So you can see it's received 3 tasks, and it's chunked them into one mail. But the user's not had anything. We can see the mail, but as I say, we can see the inbox there. There's no new mails. The only thing we can see is the deleted items increasing. Now, you can get around that. You can just set up a mail a mail rule to wipe those. The reason I left it in was just to make sure it was working, because it can be fairly transparent to the user. But again, I think this is quite an interesting channel, and I know at least one of our clients that we've worked with didn't have outbound web connections. Their environment, they just didn't have web-based comms. They only had mail, and this kind of thing was pretty effective for them for getting C2 in that environment. So to wrap up, because I've nearly run out of time, I think network-based beacon detection is kind of gaining more traction. It's probably going to get better, particularly as we start to integrate and augment analysis with AI. The great thing for red teams is I think a lot of the C2 tradecraft to get around some of these detections does exist. It's just not really being frequently or heavily used at the moment. And there's lots more to this. I think, as I sort of said on the very first slide and at the start of the talk, a lot of focus in kind of C2-based stuff is on evasion, is on endpoint evasion, EDR evasion, that kind of stuff. But there's lots of interesting things you can do just around the C2. And there's lots of stuff that I've not even covered in this talk. For example, custom transports for peer-to-peer, doing things that are different. When I see detections built around peer-to-peer-based comms, they're usually around things like name pipes, TCP beacons, that kind of stuff, things that are natively in the beacon. But if you start to use other protocols, things that people aren't necessarily looking for, you kind of get a bit more, you get a bit more freedom, really. So I guess the main thing is I'm just saying, as red teamers, let's be a bit more creative. Let's start doing some interesting things with the C2. If this is something you're interested in, I would recommend looking at some of the materials that this guy Cybermonk's put out. He's probably one of the most active researchers, I would say, working in this kind of beacon detection, network-based beacon detection space. He's got some really good blog posts. There's one up on his Blue Raven blog which talks about leveraging MDE and the aggregated reports that I kind of touched on at the start of the talk for building KQL queries for doing beacon detection. So there is some interesting stuff I think that he's done which is pretty relevant. And that's any questions?